and
this meeting is being recorded.
She's been a consultant for about 30 years with periods at Scottish Coal and ACOM. And she's currently the director of her own consultancy, Finley Ecology Services Limited, which is largely based in the Scottish borders and north of England. Notable work she's done is that she led the team that undertook the Otter Survey of Scotland in 2011 to 12 for Nature Scot. And she's also co-author of the Otter Survey Competencies Guidelines for SAIEM. Starting, I think, probably about 7 years ago, Mel started a PhD looking at evidence-based approaches to identification of otter resting sites, which are protected under European legislation. And she finished that PhD in 2020. And she's got a couple of papers published from that, which are available, and I'm sure Mel will mention. And also some of that work is featured in SAIEM's In Practice magazine. Mel's done various training relating to her kind of expertise and research on otters. In fact, I met Mel at an otter training course quite a few years ago. And she's done training on otter ecology, surveying and camera trapping for SAIEM. Mel's also a member of the IUCN Otter Specialist Group as well. Okay, so I'll hand you over to Mel now.
Okay, Mel, I've stopped sharing, so you can share your screen. And off you go.
I'll get there in a minute. Sorry, folks.
Brilliant, don't worry.
Can you see the...
Yes, we can see the screen. You need to go into slideshow.
Oh, from beginning, yeah.
From beginning or from current slide should work fine.
I don't know why that's not working.
Try from current slide.
Why does it... Right, resume slideshow from beginning.
Just because it's quite stressful doing presentations, that's why.
Is that better?
Brilliant, absolutely fine.
Right, okay, sorry about that, people. There's always a glitch when I'm involved. So, am I good to start then?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us this evening, and I hope this is going to be of interest to you. But I can't see you anyway, so if you do fall asleep, I won't know. Right. So we're going to be looking at, I'm going to really give you a quick pit stop tour of some research that I've done, what I've spent a long time doing actually, the last 5 or 6 years, looking at camera trapping at otter resting sites. And this evening, I'm just going to talk a little bit about understanding setup and also sampling duration, which I hope will give you food for thought. So the research is a partnership between Finley Ecology Services, which is my company, and Edinburgh Napier University. And the research I'm going to be talking about is derived from my thesis, which is optimization of monitoring using camera traps and field evidence when identifying otter resting or breeding sites. So the research fell into 3 main areas. So I'd already been looking at otter resting sites with camera traps, and I had a 6-year data set from a single site. So I did some analysis of that. I was quite keen at looking detection probabilities, because often I would get sprints in front of a camera trap and no otters, and it was like, what the hell is going on? And then also we did a much larger camera trap survey across the Tweed catchment, and we were looking there at the relationship, or any relationship, between field evidence and the use of resting sites, and we also did some analysis on optimization of methodology. So it's really easy to put a camera trap out and get interesting footage of otters. I've got a couple of examples here. So that's not an otter. That's a mink, a male mink. And it's just doing its thing. This was on one of our otter study sites. A bit of a commotion, and because it's camera trap footage, I haven't edited it together. But you get the gist, you know, there's a mink there, and, you know, an otter's having a pretty good go at that mink. And we got that a couple of times, actually. And that was really interesting. And you can put camera traps out and you can get really interesting observational videos like that, or stills. Oh, here we go again. But when you apply camera trapping to either scientific studies or to consultancy applications, it's not a case of just getting images. It's not a case of just capturing a nice otter and seeing this, that, and the other, or even looking at, you know, what they're doing with mink. You know, you've got very, very specific aims in mind. And there are two underpinning considerations in camera trap studies, and the first one is getting the best detection probability. And I've spoken to quite a few people who basically say there's no problem camera trapping otters. I put a camera trap out when I see otters, but my answer is always, yeah, you do see otters, but what are you not seeing? You know, how many otters are you missing? And the second consideration is the best layout of the camera traps to gain whatever data you need. So you might be looking at presence, absence of otter or any other species, or activity patterns or resting behaviour. And I'm really going to be talking about the first one to start off with, detection probability. So detection probability is the probability of recording an animal if it passes through the area which is monitored by the motion detector. And you can see this on this photograph here. I've got an array of 3 camera traps, and we had CCTV running as well. So we could see when an otter ran past the camera traps, and we could see how fast it was running, and we could see what distance it was from the camera traps as well. But I quite like this photo because you can see how small the otter is. I mean, I know they're a metre thereabouts from nose to tail, but in terms of height, they're really low to the floor, lower than badgers. So you can see the height that we've got the camera trap set up there, which was something about 20 centimetres. But you could see an otter could go underneath the camera traps and not be seen. That's called the sneak zone, by the way. So what we know about camera trapping from other published studies is that the height of the camera traps should be set around about the shoulder height of your target animal or group of animals. So for an otter, that's pretty low down. And you've got things like vegetation to consider as well. And I'll leave that on with you. Maybe we can pick up on that in the discussion. And the camera trap angle, the camera should be parallel to the ground. So if you've got a slope, you still want to be parallel to the ground. So it doesn't necessarily mean the camera trap's upright. It's, you know, your field of view, your detection zone should be parallel to the ground or slightly down pointing. And we also know that the size of the animal affects detection probability. And that's a really black and white statement, but it's not really a black and white issue, because you might be able to, you know, detect a rabbit at 2 meters, but at 12 meters, you might not be able to detect that rabbit. So that's all tied in with distance as well. So we used CCTV to record continuously as a control, so we could see exactly what was going on. And we found that with otters and other UK mammals, badgers and foxes we were looking at, the distance between the camera trap and the target area is absolutely critical. And I wouldn't really recommend anybody going beyond about 2 meters. And I saw some chat on Facebook recently, and distances, camera trap distances for otters were talked about. And I just thought, you know, we've really got to crack this one. There's no point in putting camera traps out at 5 meters because you just won't get the data to support any conclusion. Trigger time. So trigger time is the time that it takes the motion detector to detect the animal. So that's even before the camera switches on. And the trigger time, the trigger is happens through a motion. It's a passive infrared motion detector. So it's looking for a moving heat signature. And the delay between sorry, I'm getting really fuddled here. The delay between the motion detector switching on and detecting a mammal pass on the camera is the trigger time. I can come back to that because I know I've just fluffed my way through that one. But if anyone wants to ask later on, that's fine. So 2 camera traps are better than 1. That we found that invariably. Wet otters have a very low detection probability, and we're talking about 36 to 43% trigger probability. So that's not even capture. So you might get a trigger, the motion detector might go, yay, there's an otter. But by the time the camera comes on, the otter might have left the field of view at 2.5 meters. Video data offers more than still images, so things like you can hear calling, you can see the animals having a wee, you can see, you know, sort of a bit more about the movement, how they move. That helps to sex the animals. And we also found that slower moving animals produce a better trigger stimulus. So you can have something bombing past and the camera is just like, what? And it doesn't even wake up. And also we did some thermal imaging and we found that it took about 32 seconds after leaving water for an otter to develop that thermal footprint of 3 degrees, which is what the camera trap is really looking for. I know I've really whizzed through that. I could talk about that for an hour, which is why I've fluffed it. And I'm going to show some references in a minute, and you can request those from me if you wish. I've got all of them, so I can just send them out as PDFs if you're interested. So this is an example of one of our study sites. We had 2 camera traps at about 1 to 1.5 meters at different angles from the entrance of a resting site. So you can see that big old ash tree. You can see there's a hole in the base of the ash tree, and we had a female with 2 cubs in there. We had a male in there. It was quite a nice resting site. But even though those 2 cameras were at similar distances from the ash tree, they had different, they picked up on different bits of behaviour. So sometimes the otter was there and they both recorded it, but sometimes one or the other would record it because of the angle they are to the resting site entrance. The height was about 20 centimetres. That's always a bit of a compromise because you have to consider the vegetation as well. They were parallel to the ground and the site wasn't immediately next to water, which is another thing that, you know, we really need to consider as a major constraint when camera trapping otters. And just as an added interest, just note the habitat. You know, where's the scrub? We all think that otters rest in dense vegetation, but when they've got a really good structure, that's not the case. So there's the references. I'm not going to read those out, but they're the ones that I was sort of, you know, describing things from. So you're quite welcome to contact me for any of those. So what actually is a resting site? This is the nub of our work, isn't it, really? We have to go out and find resting sites, and that's the expectation that Natural England and Nature Scott put on us. Oh my goodness, what an expectation. So as part of the research, I had to define what a resting site was. I had to have a really clear idea of what a resting site is. And I would just throw it out there to you. How many of you have actually sat down, looked at the legislation, looked at any guidance, and actually rationalised what a resting site is? And if you haven't, or if you have and you haven't seen this document, I would direct you to it. We're essentially still working with the European guidance since Brexit, and this 2007 document gives guidance on the strict protection of European protected species. And it makes the distinction between otters and bats also as wide-ranging species versus other things like freshwater pearl mussels, for instance, that aren't. And I've just put three quotes from those guidance, because I think that really, you know, is relevant to what we do as consultants. So they said it's not possible to provide a rigid definition of a breeding site and a resting place that will apply to all taxa. So they're setting the scene there. They're saying this legislation is generic. And they say to restrict the definition of a breeding and a resting site to a locality that can be clearly delimited. And they actually give the halt of an otter as one of the two examples. And the third one, which is really difficult for otter, is you should have, so this is because the legislation says that those resting sites are protected even when the animal is absent. So in order for that to be worthwhile, there has to be a reasonably high probability that the species concerned will return to these sites and places. So when you're out on the river and you find a bit of sprain and a bit of a ledge, could you put your hand on your heart and say, yes, I think there's a reasonable probability that the otter will return here to rest? So running along with that, we decided to look at the duration of time spent within the structure to see, well, how do otters use their halts? Are they in there, you know, are they in there all the time? Do they only go to their halts for resting? Are they there at other times? So in order to define a rest, we looked at the activity at resting sites. So this is an example of what we would call a very clear rest. So you can see it's on the 28th of March at 6:30 in the morning, which is really typical. And you've got an otter going into massive hollow willow tree, and you couldn't actually see the entrance to the chamber. It was really hidden. And then later on at 7 o'clock, the otter's nice and dry and fluffy. It comes out and it leaves the site. And I actually had two camera traps on. I just chose to put this footage in because it was nicer than the footage, but you could see it coming out of the structure. So that's a really clear example of a rest, and we can then calculate how long that otter has been in the resting site. So we did, oh no. So on the long-term study site, we used this approach and looked at how long the otter or otters spent inside the halt. And we saw that there was a really clear bimodal distribution. So it seemed like the otters were there for a really, really short period of time. So in this graph A, you can see a peak at 0. This is time spent in halt minutes along the x-axis. There's a peak at 0, and then as you get further along, there's another peak that's maybe about 700 or 800 minutes, which is quite a long time actually to spend in the halt. And when you look at the first 30 minutes, you can see again you've got this peak, a very, very short amount of time. So we thought that about 15 minutes captured all of these very short visits to halts, and anything longer than 15 minutes we would classify as a rest. And when we went on to do the Tweed study, where we looked at 26 structures across the River Tweed catchment, and we camera trapped each of those sites for 12 months or there, but some of them were destroyed by storms and some of them we did a little bit longer. We had 2 camera traps at each site. Every 3 weeks we went out, well I went out and counted spraints and any other footprints or bedding or any other field signs there were. And then looked at the videos and did the data analysis from the videos, and we thought, yeah, we'll use the same approach on the Tweed study, and we found that that 15-minute threshold to define the difference between a visit to a resting site and a rest stood up really well. So after doing all this camera trapping, you know, one of the fundamental questions when you're camera trapping with a particular aim is, how long do I have to leave my camera traps out there? So we did some simulations on the data to look at different scenarios. So we looked at the time of year and we looked at the sampling pattern. So to be honest, the time of year was an absolute no-brainer, because 95% of our rests across the Tweed at our study structures occurred in the winter-spring period, which we're defining as December to May. So that was a really big surprise. I mean, it's echoed what we found in our other study sites, but, you know, it really indicates that some resting sites are actually more important than others, and that in the summer maybe, well, a radio tracking study found that in the summer otters use enclosed resting sites less than in the winter. So in the winter they obviously have a greater need for protection. And also we found that these sites were used from one year to the next. So there was site fidelity within the winter-spring period and also from one winter-spring period to the next winter-spring period. So looking at the optimum camera trapping sampling, so obviously because all of our rests, or most of our rests, were in winter and spring, there was no point in including summer and autumn. So we basically said, right, we'll just simulate different patterns in winter and spring. So first of all, we thought, what about if we just did one long continuous period of camera trapping? How many days would we have to leave our camera traps out in order to detect a rest? And once you've got a rest, really, you've got a resting site. So across all, so you'll know I said that we had 6 resting sites, but some we studied for more than one winter-spring period. So we've got 8 instances that we could, 8 winter-spring periods that we could include in the analysis. So if you merged all the winter-spring into one continuous period of time, to have detected a rest just with one period of camera trapping, you would have needed 108 days to have caught all of those sites, all of those 8 winter-spring periods. I don't know whether I'm being clear here. So the mean was 65 days, but if you camera trap for 65 days, you wouldn't have been camera trapping long enough to detect a rest at approximately half the sites. So to detect a rest at all of the sites, we would have had to have left our camera traps out for 108 days. So how many weeks is that? How many months is that? How shocked are you all feeling now after doing camera trap surveys for a couple of weeks, which is what we all do, and it's what, you know, it's what some competent authorities are advising. And then we thought, well, that's not the only approach. Winter spring's a long time. What about if we did 2 equal periods of camera trapping? So one in winter and then one in spring. And we found that there was quite a saving if you did that. So it's more efficient to do 2 periods of camera trapping. And we found that 2 periods of 38 days would have detected a rest at all of those sites. And again, you know, the mean is a lot lower. So that sounds better, doesn't it? That does sound better, but it's still probably a lot more than what you would have thought. And, you know, whether we can roll things out from our Tweed study, you know, can we generalize from that? It's not good practice to generalize from a small sample, but this is the only sample that we have to run on. So the other thing is, some people have said to me, oh no, we won't need field ecologists anymore because we've got camera traps and we've got gadgets for this and gadgets for that, and it's going to take all the fun out of it. Well, I can assure you that camera trapping is well good fun. It's like the best. But you have to start off with a field survey. So here's just a picture on the left hand side. Can you see my cursor there? That's the ecologist. It's not me, I might add. So, you know, trekking through all of the, you know, the dense vegetation is still going to be required, and it's still going to be really, you know, time intensive. And you do have to really sort of look at structures and look at field evidence as well as a starting point, but it's only a starting point and it's not to be relied on. And so, and when looking at these structures, it's really important to have a good look. So we use this thing on the left, which is called a shaftoscope, to look inside structures to see whether they're big enough, whether they're dry enough, whether they're, you know, suitable for resting otters or families of otters. So the situation today with otters is that, well, generally speaking, breeding birds, bats, great crested newts, they've all got really prescriptive survey efforts out there, and some of them have, you know, mitigation flow charts or whatever that you can follow. And that makes it really nice and clear, because you know that you've done enough. You know when that end point is, that you can say, actually, we've followed the guidelines and we didn't find, or we followed the guidelines and we did find. But with otters get a really rubbish deal at the moment. So they get a couple of visits at most, probably in the summer, actually I might add, probably in the summer with water voles, when otters are at their lowest ease of detection, and where resting sites can look really neglected. Our resting sites, some of them you wouldn't have found them in the summer. And it's normally that the surveys normally directed to look at spraints or field signs, or resting sites, you know, based on received wisdom, or, you know, I can feel it in my waters type approach. And I'm not pouring scorn on that, because there's nothing else that we can do. We have nothing else to give us that evidence. And, you know, and I've been there, I've looked for resting sites in that way and confidently thought to myself, yes, this is definitely a resting site, but looking back on it, thought, no way it was, you know, 10 years ago or whatever. And also with camera trap surveys, there's no industry guidelines, so we don't know whether 5 days is enough, 10 days is enough, or 15. And, you know, normally what consultants do is look for the nearest fence post or the nearest tree and whack a camera trap onto that for a couple of weeks. So I think it's time for us to sort of move on, really move away from that, and I'm hoping that the research that I've done is going to put us and otters in a better situation. So at the moment, things that are going on at the moment, the Mammal Society are writing a new otter survey and mitigation guidelines, and that's ongoing at the moment, but it's pretty slow going, but it, you know, eventually it will come out. And I'm part of that team, so I'm hoping to inject what I've learnt through my research, and it's likely to be very different actually from what the current situation is. Developing training materials and courses in partnership with Edinburgh Napier University, that's ongoing as well. We're busy beavering away and hatching plots to do various things to try and you know, provide some accessible evidence and things that you can really relate to when you're out in the field. And also we'd love to write some camera trapping guidelines on otters and just the general principles for use in consultancy. That's something that's, you know, it's something that we really want to do, but you know, haven't got too far with it at the moment, but hopefully it'll happen in the not too distant future. I have no idea what I'm doing with time because I can't see a clock. But, so that's all, folks. Thank you very much. It would be really nice to see some of you at training events in the future, and I'm happy to take any questions. It would be interesting actually to hear what your thoughts are on the survey effort to detect a resting site. But actually it's more a case you'd have to do all of that survey effort to say that site is not used for resting. You might get a rest within a week, depending upon when you put your camera traps out. So that's me. I'm going to stop sharing now and hand over to somebody to do questions. Hello.
Thanks very much, Mel. That was very interesting, and half an hour, so well timed as well. Okay, so we're going to move on to question/discussion. So if anyone has any questions for Mel, or want to make any comments, etc., please come on.
Well, we've got somebody saying they want to hug Mel in the chat. Bruce, would you like to unmute yourself and talk directly to Mel?
Well, yes, yeah, slightly embarrassingly. Yeah, no, that was brilliant. I've always felt when sort of carrying out work in selected areas on behalf of clients that there hasn't been enough effort put in. But there's nothing to justify further effort, and so it kind of cut short, and I feel like I'm missing things out. So knowing that this work's gone on is fantastic. So brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, thank you for saying that. That's made my day.
I could hug you, but I wouldn't due to COVID reasons. Thank you.
Sorry, I muted myself. Melissa has posed a question in the chat. Can you see the chat, Mel?
Oh, yes, I can now.
Okay, so Mel's asking, why are otters less detectable in summer?
Okay, that's a really good question. I won't say that on camera. Well, it's debatable. So some people think that otters sprint less in the summer, so they're not leaving signs. They're not so scent marky in the summer. It may be that they're scent marking at the same frequency, but the vegetation grows up and we just can't find them. I don't know. I used to think that otters disappeared from butts. I was going to say that in the summer, because they can be really tricky to find and follow. So I suspect there is a change in sprinting behavior. But one thing actually to note is that the number of sprints and the sprinting frequency that you find does not relate to the number of otters or the amount of activity of otters. All it tells you is that an otter has been here, or one or more otters have been here. So in a way, sprint surveys are redundant. We should just assume that otters are present, I think, in Scotland anyway, and probably across a lot of England and Wales now. So
there's a question from Carolyn in the chat.
Sorry, just unmuted myself. I was just wondering if you had a larger sample size of potential resting places or a larger area that you would be looking at. Do you think that there would be guidance at some point that would, maybe capture 80% or, some other majority, but a lower threshold than 100% of the resting places that you're looking at that would potentially be acceptable?
Possibly. I suppose it depends on the risk. So if it was a scientific study, then you could set that threshold, and in real life it wouldn't have any consequences. It would affect your research and your how you discussed your research, but then it's in the form of a discussion. But as soon as you apply it to a consultancy application and you start talking about 80%, well, rather than talking about 80% chance of detecting arrest, you're talking about a 20% chance of not detecting a resting site. I don't know how that would go down with the likes of the competent authorities, or whatever you want to call them. But potentially that would be a way to go, because the survey effort is really high. But I think the more sites that we study, the more we can get a real handle on a reasonable amount of camera trapping effort.
Yeah, I suppose another way to look at it is at what threshold would it be acceptable to stop if you haven't recorded anything, after a certain number of days?
Yeah,
which you sort of touched on before. So. But yeah, very, very interesting. And I would agree that guidance would be very much appreciated. Thank you.
We've got another comment in the chat that's reinforcing that. Barbara is saying guidelines would be really helpful with clients who may assume we're just angling for more work. And when you were talking about the number of days you had to have the camera traps out, I was thinking, well, who's going to pay for that? That's a really tricky issue.
It's not actually that expensive in terms of consultancy fees, because camera traps are doing all the work. You know, you go out, you put them out, you could leave them, if you're really careful with your setup, you could leave them for a month. So that's not many returns to site. The time in analysis, again, you can cut down if you don't record during the daytime, although I wouldn't necessarily do that if I was in certain parts of Scotland. But you know, you could sleep your cameras from, you know, between 9 o'clock, and in fact I've just done that recently on a site, between 9 and 5, so you don't get any blinking birds or waving vegetation. You just sort of end up with otters.
Yeah,
so there are ways to
that's a good
reduce
plan.
it down.
Yeah.
But you know, in terms of months, you know, that's not what a client wants to hear, is it? But that's what a client has to hear with great crested newts when he asks for a survey, you know, at the end of June. He's got to wait until the following season. So, you know, I think our expectation of otters is that it's fairly fast and dirty. You know, you go out there, you look for spraints, you find a resting site, you know, in the 2 days that you're on site, and it doesn't work like that.
Now, the next question is from Kathy, who says, why do camera traps have to be low and parallel to the ground for surveys rather than higher up and pointing downwards?
Okay.
Which is a common technique.
Yes, I know, especially because of thefts and stuff. There is actually a paper that I could point to that was written in Australia, where they put their camera traps up really high, and the paper's entitled "The Higher You Go, the Less You'll Know." And one of the reasons is, if you put your camera trap up high, you're increasing your distance straight away. And also, if you think that the detection zone and your field of view is like a triangle that comes out of like a cone that comes out of the camera trap, if you put it parallel with the ground, you haven't got an end to that. It just sort of futters out, and it futters out. But as soon as you start pointing it to the ground, it's like shining a torch. You know, your torch reflection is much smaller if you point it down than if you point it parallel to the ground. So you really restrict your detection zone if you do that. And you know, I would say you put your camera traps low to the ground, but you put them in a pretend fence post, or other things that I've used are tree guards. So it looks, you know, a cane with a tree guard going around a camera trap with a little window cut out. Put them low to the ground and hide them.
Okay.
I hope that.
Sorry, I'm trying to rush because the question's coming in really fast. Abigail is saying, what do you think about detection dogs, the latest expanding area that we're really worried about? We did have a talk about detection dogs and pitfalls, well, last season's series.
So detection dogs, that's something that I considered when I got my dog, but he hates water and is a bit of a rubbish nose as well. So, but you know, detection dogs would find sprain oh so easily, and I think it would be really easy to train a dog to find sprains. But to find a resting site is a completely different ball game. And I'll give you a little nugget of information here that we'll sort of introduce after we've published on this, that there is a new field sign for otters that you get virtually exclusively at resting sites, and it may be that it smells different from regular sprain. So that might be something that a dog could be trained on, but I'm starting off with the assumption that it would be different from sprains. So I suspect, you know, a detection dog would have a great time, you know, barking at every little morsel of sprain that you get along a river and getting a treat every time. It'd be a very fat dog.
Okay, and the next one is from Bryony, who's saying lots of otters on camera traps, but struggling to find resting sites. Advice?
Yes, large reed bed site. That's quite you will have a lot of otter activity. It's like one of the best habitats. So what I would do is look at the time. So first of all, put your data in a spreadsheet, all your registration times, and then have a column with dawn and dusk next to all your registrations and see how close they are to dawn and dusk, because otters rest through the night. You know, they don't forage all night long, and especially in winter when the nights are long, they can rest frequently during the night. But diurnal rests, when they rest during the daytime, are heavily tied in with dawn and dusk, a bit like bat emergence times. So if you're finding you're getting hits very close regularly at dawn and dusk, you can look at the direction that the otter's moving. So if, okay, let's get this right round. So if you've got a registration just before dawn, look at the direction, and it's likely that it's going to a resting site. And equally at dusk, if you get a registration just after dusk, it's likely that the otter's coming from. So if you've got lots of camera traps out, you might be able to see a pattern. The other thing I have thought of has just gone out of my head. Oh yeah, the state of the coat, that's it. So when they come out of their resting sites, they're nice and dry and fluffy, like you saw in my 2 videos. And quite often when they go in, they're wet. So look for fluffy otters. And if you get a fluffy otter, it's come out of a resting site and it hasn't gone into the water yet. So you're really close. So it's really a case of having enough camera traps out. But reed beds are really difficult. If you're on a floating mat of vegetation, you can get movement on the, you know, on the cameras, and also you get the movement of the vegetation, which can trigger them off. So look for runs. I would say look for runs, stick them on runs, look for dawn and dusk registrations and which way they're heading and the state of their coat, and then use that as a starting point to try and sort of map where they're coming from. But they probably have more than one resting site, which isn't helpful. You might just, is it going to be developed, this large reed bed? Sorry, Anne.
Hi.
Hi.
Basically, yeah, we have we have several sites with reed bed, and they all run along a river. And this is the first time in over 10 years that any signs of otter have been on our site. So we're pretty excited.
Mm-hmm.
But I've caught them at passing places, like you said, like looking at runs, looking at what direction they're going and what time. But we haven't got any further than that. We know that there's plenty of food for them. We've done spraint surveys. You know, we've basically gone across the site, but we can't find resting places. But there are several islands that we just can't physically get to.
Right, okay.
Which, you know, they could be there, but like you said, it's hard to get that on camera because reeds are moving, filling up the SD card, the water, you know, just like everything you said.
Yeah, and you risk flooding your cameras as well.
Mm-hmm.
Just as an aside, I think Hans Crook in one of his radio tracking studies found that islands are a real dead cert for resting sites.
Yeah.
And also I found, well, there was Hans Crook found a natal holt, and when I saw in that paper, when I had a look at it, it looked very much like something that we'd found, and it was an old swan's nest. And it looked as though otters were sort of burrowing into an old, you know, one that swans have gone back to. Is quite a dense thing. And they can also make nests as well. So I've seen one resting site where, you know, the old reed stems can just sort of collapse over in one direction, and they can sort of form like a thatched roof over the base of the reed bed. I found places like that in reed beds that I've suspected very strongly. I mean, this is a few years ago, before I was quite so clued up. So
well, it's interesting you say that, because we do have something like that there was quite a bit of spraint around, and we put a camera out on it and got absolutely nothing. But like after watching this, I should have left the camera out for a lot longer.
Yeah.
So that could be a place.
Yeah, good luck with that. Good.
Thank you.
There's another question. I'm missing some questions because it relates to spraint. Tim is asking whether you find sprayed at all resting sites, or do you have some where there isn't spraint? So what's the connection between spraint and resting sites?
Okay, well, when you're talking about spraints, we found no relationship between spraints and resting sites. So the one that I showed you with the dual, like the sentry post camera traps, that's how I sort of think of them, the two camera traps at different angles, there's very, very rarely any sprain outside the structure. And then we had other sites where the resting site was absolutely plastered in spraints. But we've got a paper going through review at the moment, which goes into quite a bit of detail about the field evidence. So things like paths, there was no relationship between paths and resting sites. The bedding was a pretty good indicator. So the best resting sites have bedding in. I think all of our resting sites had bedding in, and latrines as well, which is a different type of field sign, which I'm not going to go into now, but it's quite a mega, a mega field sign that we haven't really been clued up into before in terms of resting sites. Right,
we're rapidly running out of time. 2 questions, and I'll try and combine them into one. The very obvious one, which camera traps are better at detecting wet otters than others, and guidance on when a license may be required when using a camera trap. I don't know if you can cover both of those in about 3 minutes, Mel.
Okay. The models of camera traps. No, we've only tested Bushnell trophy cams and little acorns. The Bushnells did better than the little acorns. So I don't know about any others, but our chosen camera trap that we're using at the moment is the Browning Special Ops with black IR. That's what we're using at the moment. Really rate them. Really nice little cameras, nice programming interface. Everything about them is nice. So the Brownings, that's what I would go for. Bushnell's quite good as well.
Licenses.
Oh my God, licenses. Don't get me going on licenses, because I do a lot in Scotland. I applied for a camera trapping license in England. Oh my God. So I would say that the camera traps themselves don't cause disturbance. I put a camera trap out recently at a new site, and an otter fell asleep literally about half a metre away from the camera trap. So I don't think camera traps are the issue, smell, noise, anything like that. The issue is disturbance when you go back to change them and when you're setting up. And if you think you're outside a resting site, if it's an open resting site, I would say you need a camera trap license, because you could disturb an otter. If it's like a really tight enclosed hole and you can't see the chamber, and you've got no idea how deep the chamber is into the bank, then I would say you could put a camera trap out there without disturbing the otter. If you're really careful, no phone calls or conversations or anything like that, you just put the camera trap and out. So it's a case of taking a view. But if you apply for a license, good luck in England, that's all I can say.
I think that's how we all feel about licenses in England, Mel. Just you're very lucky in Scotland and Wales. I think it's just seems much easier. Right, we seem to have run out of questions, which is great, because I'd like to ask one, which is you had something that looked like a modified endoscope.
Oh yeah, the shufty scope. Yeah.
Shufty scope, is that a technical term?
No,
a modified endoscope, or?
It's having a shufty around. I think it's like a mini DVR recorder connected to a mini camera with IR lights on attached to a screen. It's something we cobbled together. I think it's like reversing from a car reversing camera, but it's really good for doing inspections of birds' nests, looking in holes and all sorts. It's a really, really useful tool. But endoscopes have such a small field of view, that you use for bats. They're pretty useless for looking at otter structures.
Right, that's interesting. Okay, well, I think we've clearly come to a point with this where there's a real need for more research and better guidelines, isn't there? And it's a matter of how that can be achieved. I mean, obviously, you're saying that you need funding for the updating of the guidelines. And I wondered whether surely the camera trap manufacturers have a vested interest in greater use of camera trapping. Are they a possible source of funding?
Possibly, but the camera trap market is more geared for the hunting brigade in the States. That's where their big sales are from. I don't know whether they've really twigged on that there's like a massive market for research cameras, because they're not changing their designs to make them more applicable for researching, different size animals or anything. So possibly it might be an avenue.
Yes, I mean, part of the remit of, well, the reason the academic special interest group exists is to try to bridge this gap between academic research and practitioners. So we're really interested in doing anything we can to help with this. So maybe, I don't know, Patrick, how could we help?
Well, I suppose I've got a conflict of interest because I'm involved in the research as well. But yeah, I think it. I don't know how we could help, but yeah, I think that's the next step. So what Mel's worked on for the last few years is building what's in a parlance is often called the underpinning research. But now we need the impact of that research. There's no point in it sitting in scientific papers, although those are available for people to read. It's getting it out there in accessible language with easy to follow guidelines with a clear evidence base. And I think that's the stage. That's very much the stage that Mel's in at the moment. In terms of her research, is actually translating it into impact and improving outcomes for otters. Whether in some cases that might mean more, more work done. In some cases it's less. Like a piece of research Mel did that she's not talked about was, on how efficient could you be with length of video? So obviously video is good for otters, but if you set your videos to 30 seconds or 60 seconds, that's a lot of memory. That's a lot of time while watching analysis. So one of Mel's analysis was to say, how short could you make your videos without losing too much information? And the idea is that makes it more efficient for researchers, consultants, when they do their analysis, but still to get the same high quality data.
Yeah, the number of people we've had attending tonight and showing interest in this definitely shows there is an interest, which maybe is something that drive it forward. Okay, it's 5 to 7. We must finish dead on 7. So I'm just going to share my screen again and move on to my second slide. To remind everyone that these meetings happen on the 3rd Thursday of the month during basically term time. So we're not having a discussion event in April, and we tend not to have them over the summer as well, August. But 19th of May, Patrick's leading a discussion on where robots could come into ecology. I don't know whether you want to say a word about that, Patrick.
Yeah, I think there's been quite a lot of talk about how technology might change, our jobs as ecologists. I mean, today's an example with camera traps, but this idea of robots maybe taking on roles and allowing us to sample more efficiently or in ways that we couldn't sample before is quite an interesting one. And it made me think about Mel's Shifty Cam, because I just read a paper just 2 days ago about something called a wombat, which is a robot that is sent down wombat burrows to sample, take samples, monitor or record temperature and things like that. So I think these things have the potential to really change the way we survey wildlife. So One of my colleagues who's a robotics scientist is going to come along. We're just going to have a bit of a discussion about, what robots are out there already, what are the potentials in the future, etc. So hopefully it'll be quite interesting for everyone.
Okay, and in June we've got Dr. Rachel Tarlington coming. She was talking to me about how the majority, apparently, of the vet students that she's teaching are more interested in wildlife health than they are in pets and domestic animals. And they've been trying to find placements for them to do work experience, if you like, projects, working with ecological consultants. And she's also been leading the work on COVID monitoring of UK wildlife. You might be aware that they've been sampling white-tailed deer in America, and that has really raised awareness of just how widespread COVID is in wildlife. Not so much in the UK, you'll be glad to hear. So she's agreed to come and talk about that, which I think will be really interesting. And Paul Lister-Smith, who's a member of the ASIG committee, is going to talk about his speciality, which is the Killarney fern, and surveying for it in the July meeting. We'll then have another series of meetings in September, October, November, Sian, I think. We usually do a September, even though it's quite early in the university calendar. If there's any topics you think it would be good to discuss, do get in touch, and you should everyone who booked on the event will receive a copy, a link to the recording. Okay, so 1 minute to 7. So thank you all very much for coming, and hope to see you at one of the future events.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you very much, Mel.
Bye. Thanks.
Mel, if you just hang on for a minute
Okay.
when everyone's gone. Sian, did you notice how many we had? I noticed 60 at one point.
Yeah, that was the maximum.
Right. Okay.
I noticed a couple of previous MSc students, Mel, that did projects with you.
Oh, right. Right. That's nice.
Joanna Coxon and Alicia.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah.
I bumped into